At the western edge of the Sweetgrass country, where the shortgrass ran on for a full day's ride, without a fence or a road to break it, there was one place the drought had not been able to break, and every rider and every head of stock in that country knew the way to it. It was the crossing on Wolf Creek, where the trail out of the flats came down off a bench of red rock and met the one live water left for 30 miles in any direction. In a wet year, Wolf Creek was one water among many, and nobody troubled themselves over who held it. In the third dry summer, with the buffalo wallows gone to cracked clay and the earthen tanks showing their bottoms like empty skillets, the crossing on Wolf Creek was the whole difference between an outfit that lived through the year and one that blew away with the dust, and the woman who held it rode down to it every evening at the last hour of light on the most beautiful horse left in the basin. She came out of the low sun with the grass turned to bronze around her and her shadow thrown long across the bench, and the horse under her carried his head like a thing that had never once been made afraid. He was a magnificent storm-gray gelding, near 17 hands, his coat the color of a thunderhead, black-maned and black-legged, the finest horse the diamond ever raised. And when the light caught him at that hour, he did not look like an animal a person owned so much as a piece of the coming weather that had wandered down onto the grass and decided to stay. His name was Slate. The woman on him was Della Rourke, and she was a rangy, sun-brown woman in a faded blue prairie dress. A dark braid roped under a flat-brimmed hat, with steady slate-gray eyes and a horseman's quiet hands, and she had held her late father's ranch alone through a year that had taken from her nearly everything but the horse and the water and the stubbornness her father had left her in the place of money. The ranch was called the Diamond, and its mark was a diamond, a plain four-cornered figure her father had chosen, because it was the simplest honest shape a running iron could not easily turn into a lie. Thomas Rourke had ridden into the Sweetgrass country, a poor man with a borrowed horse, and had found the crossing on Wolf Creek before the big outfits knew what the water would someday be worth. And he had filed on it and held it and built a small, good ranch on it with his 2 hands, and he had a saying about the country he had chosen that he had repeated so often across so many years that Della had stopped hearing it until the spring the fever took him, after which she seemed to hear it in everything. "The prairie," he had said, "gives you dust in the one hand and a diamond in the other. And the whole art of living out here is knowing which is which and closing your fingers on the right one before the wind comes up." He had named the ranch for the day he found the water. Dust in one hand, the diamond in the other. Della had been closing her fingers on the diamond every day of the year since they had buried him on the low knoll above the creek. And there were mornings she was not at all sure she had the strength in her hand to keep them closed. There was a note against the ranch besides, held by the bank in the county seat, a debt her father had taken in the last good year to buy up more stock, and had meant to pay off easy out of the following season's sales, and then the following season had come in dry, and the one after it drier. And the note had rolled over twice now, with the interest piling onto it like drift snow onto a fence, and the banker, who was a careful man and no friend of a small outfit in a falling market, had let Della know in his dry, careful way that he could not carry it forever. She did the sums by lamplight on the nights she could not sleep, which were most nights that year. And the sums always came out the same. If she could bring the whole calf crop through to the fall sale fat and sound and get a fair price for them, she could pay the note down far enough to buy another year. And if she lost much stock, or if the price broke, or if any one of a dozen things went wrong that a person alone could not guard against all at once, the diamond would go to the bank, and the crossing on Wolf Creek with it, and there was exactly one man in the county with the ready money and the standing to buy a foreclosed water right off the courthouse steps. And Della did not have to write his name at the bottom of her figures to know whose it was. On those nights she would bank the lamp and go out to the corral in the dark, and the storm-gray gelding would come to the rail to her, out of the black, and drop his big head against her chest and stand. And she would put her arms up around his jaw and lean the whole weight of the year against him, and breathe the warm grass and horse smell of him, and take off him the way she had taken all year. A steadiness she could find nowhere else on the earth now that her father was under the knoll. He was worth more, that horse, than the ranch owed the bank. There had been buyers for him, good ones, men who knew a horse the moment they threw a leg over one, and Della had told every last one of them no, because a person can sell a great many things when the wolf is at the door and still be who she was in the morning, but there are one or two she cannot sell and stay herself, and the storm-gray gelding was the last of those she had left to her. The diamond was a small outfit, and it had grown smaller in the drought. Where her father had run better than 2,000 head across the open range in the good years, Della ran a few hundred now, gathered in close to the water, and every one of them wore the plain diamond on the left hip, and every one of them was slick and sound and fat on the grass the creek kept green. That was the thing men who did not know cattle failed to understand about the diamond. It was a small outfit, but it sat on the best water in the country, and good water made good stock, and there were cattlemen in the Sweetgrass with 10 times Della's numbers, whose herds went into the dry months gaunt and ribby, while her few hundred head stayed heavy and glossy, because they never had to walk more than a mile to drink. In a country parched to the bone, the poorest-looking ranch on the map held the richest thing on it, and there was one man who had understood that fact for a long time and had been waiting, patient as a shelf of rock, for the drought to make it too valuable to leave in a woman's hands. His name was Elias Coyle, and he owned the Kite. The Kite was the biggest outfit in the Sweetgrass country, and the biggest for a good way past it, a spread so large that a rider leaving its headquarters at dawn could ride until dark and not come to the far edge of the land it claimed to use. Its mark was a kite, a four-cornered diamond figure with a straight tail dropping from the lower point, and that tail was the whole trouble in the world, though Della did not yet know it on the evening this account begins. Elias Coyle was a broad, heavy-jowled cattleman in a fine gray broadcloth coat, a heavy gold watch chain across his vest, and a soft voice that never needed to rise. And he was the president of the Sweetgrass Stock Association, which meant that in a country with a weak law and a long way to the nearest court, Elias Coyle very nearly was the law, or as close to it as made no difference to a small outfit that got on his wrong side. He had come to Thomas Rourke twice with an offer for the diamond and the crossing, once in a good year and once in a lean one, and both times Thomas had poured him coffee and heard him out and told him, courteous as a deacon, that the water was not for sale at any figure, because the water was the ranch, and a man does not sell the one thing that makes all the rest worth having. Coyle had smiled both times and finished his coffee and ridden away, and Thomas had watched him go and said to Della, who was standing in the door, that a man who smiles when you tell him no is a man who has decided to get the thing some other way, and that she should remember it after he was gone. She had remembered it. She had not yet understood how right he had been. On the evening this account begins, Della sat slate on the bench above the crossing and watched the last of the diamond stock come down to water in the long light, and she let herself be for 1 hour, simply glad. The cattle waded into the shallows and drank and stood, and the swallows cut low over the creek after the evening insects, and the storm-gray gelding under her dropped his head and sighed the long sigh a good horse gives at the end of a day's work, and the whole country went gold, and then rose, and then the deep blue of the coming dark. And Della sat and let it happen to her without hurrying it. It was the hour her father had loved. It was the hour she felt him nearest. She counted the stock out of long habit as they lifted their heads and drifted back up onto the grass to bed down, and it was in the counting that the first cold finger of the thing to come touched her. because when she had counted twice, she came up 11 head short of the tally she had carried in her head that morning. And 11 head was not a number the drought explained, and it was not a number that strayed off on its own from the best water in the country on the best grass. And she sat very still on the storm-gray horse in the last of the light, and felt the gladness go out of the evening like water going down into dry ground. She told herself, riding home in the dark, that 11 head was nothing. Cattle drifted. A bunch might have worked up a draw after a green patch and be back at the water by morning. She told herself several reasonable things, and she did not believe any of them, because she had grown up on this range and she knew the difference in her bones between stock that had drifted and stock that had been moved, and there had been. At the upper end of the bench where she had last seen the missing 11 that morning, a churn of sign in the dust that a drifting bunch does not leave. She had not stopped to read it. She would read it in the morning. She rode home to the low, dark house under the cottonwoods by the creek, and put the storm gray gelding up, and rubbed him down by feel in the dark. And the old man, who was the last hand left on the diamond, came out of the bunkhouse with a lantern to see who was riding in so late. His name was Griffin Hale, and everyone had called him Griff for so long that his given name had the strangeness of a stranger's. He was her late father's oldest hand, a stove-up, bow-legged old rider, white-whiskered and slow to speak, whose rope-scarred hands could still gentle any horse on the place, and he had come to the Sweetgrass country with Thomas Rourke in the beginning, and had stayed through the good years, and had refused, when Thomas was buried, and the money ran thin, and Della could no longer pay him a proper wage, to be sent away. He worked now for his keep and his tobacco, and the right to be buried. When his time came, on the same knoll as the man he had followed, and he was worth in Della's private accounting more than any 3 hands she could have hired if she had the money to hire them. He held the lantern up and looked at her face and did not ask her what was wrong, which was one of the several thousand things she valued in him. He waited. "We're short," she said. 11 head, off the upper bench. There's sign up there I don't like." Griff worked his tobacco and looked past her into the dark toward the creek. "Rustled?" he said. "I don't know yet. I'll cut the sign in the morning." She hung the gelding's blanket over the rail and stood a moment with her hand on the horse's warm shoulder, taking a kind of steadiness off him the way she had all year. 11 head we can't spare, Griff." "No," the old man agreed. "We can't." He did not say the other thing, which was that a small outfit hanging on by its fingernails could stand to lose 11 head about, as well as a person going under for the 3rd time could stand to lose a lungful of air. And he did not say it, because she knew it as well as he did, and because saying a hard thing out loud to Della Rourke had never once made it easier for her to carry. He lit her way to the house with the lantern, an old courtesy from the days when there had been more people on the place to be courteous to, and he went back to the bunkhouse, and Della lay awake a long time listening to the creek and to the small wind in the cottonwoods and thinking about the churn of sign at the upper end of the bench. And somewhere in the deep of the night it stopped being 11 head in her mind and started being the first move in a game whose board she could not yet see. And she was right, and she slept badly, and she was up before the light. She cut the sign at the upper bench in the gray of the morning, with the dew still on the grass, and what she read there took the last of the comfortable explanations away from her. Della Rourke could read ground the way a lettered person reads a page. Her father had taught her, from the time she was barely tall enough to see over a horse's back, that the range keeps an honest tally of everything that crosses it, that dust and mud and bent grass and the small habits of hooves will tell the truth to anyone patient enough to get down and look, and that a rider who could read sign was never truly lost and never truly fooled. He had made a game of it with her on the long rides, reading out the country as they crossed it. Here a bunch of antelope had crossed at a run, 3 days back, spooked. Here a lone rider had passed at a walk, leading a pack horse since the last rain. Here the old boar coon came down to the creek every night by the same slanting path, and the game had made of her, without her ever quite deciding to become one. The best tracker in the Sweetgrass country, better than her father in the end. Better than any man on the Kite, though none of them knew it yet. She got down off the storm, gray gelding at the upper bench, and dropped his reins and read the ground on her knees in the wet grass, and the ground told her its honest tally, and the tally was this. 11 head had been gathered here, quietly, in the dark, and pushed off to the north. They had not drifted. Drifting stock spreads out and grazes as it goes and leaves a wide loose scatter of sign. These 11 had been bunched tight and moved steadily, the way stock moves when a rider is behind them, keeping them together and pointed. And there had been 2 riders at the least, one to push and one to point, and they had shod horses, which no diamond horse but slate wore in the dry months, because iron was money and the grass country was soft. And they had done one thing more, one careful thing, that turned the whole matter from a bad piece of luck into something with a mind behind it. Where the trail of the moved stock crossed the hard bare shelf of red rock at the head of the bench, where shod hooves would have left scars a person could feel blind, someone had gotten down and swept the rock with a bough of cedar, patient and thorough, so that the trail simply ended at the edge of the flats, as if the 11 head and the 2 riders had lifted off the ground like the swallows and flown. A rustler who steals for the eating money does not sweep rock behind him in the dark. A rustler who sweeps rock is not stealing cattle for the eating money. He is stealing them for a reason, and the reason matters more to him than the cattle do, and he does not want the reason read. And that thought sat Della Rourke back on her heels in the wet grass, with the storm-gray horse cropping quietly behind her, and for the first time she felt something colder than worry, which was the particular fear a person feels on realizing that they have been chosen, singled out, made the object of another person's patient attention, without ever having been told why. She did not follow the swept trail onto the flats. That was her first mistake, though she could not have known it, and she came in time to forgive herself for it. Because a lone rider following a fresh trail into open country, held by a big outfit that did not want her, there was a rider asking to vanish in her turn. She marked the place in her mind, and she rode the whole outer edge of the Diamond Range that day. All of it, from the crossing on Wolf Creek, clear around to the broken country under the Rincon Rim. And everywhere the story was the same wherever the diamond grass ran up against the open flats to the north. Sign of stock gathered and moved in the night. Sign swept clean at the hard places. Once, in soft ground along a dry wash, the clear, deep print of a shod horse standing a long time, cocked hip, waiting, while up ahead its rider worked, and beside the print the small bright litter of a hand-rolled smoke pinched out and dropped, and Della picked the pinched-out smoke up off the ground, and turned it in her fingers, and smelled it, and it was a black twist tobacco she knew, because she had smelled it before, on the wind, at the association meetings in town, coming off the range boss of the Kite, and she put the small cold thing in the pocket of her faded blue dress, and rode home in the dark for the second night running with the beginnings of a terrible understanding taking shape in her, and she did not sleep that night either. By the end of that first week the diamond was better than 40 head short, and Della had stopped telling herself reasonable things. She was not the only outfit losing stock. That was the piece of it she could not, in the beginning, make fit. Word came in on the freight road and at the water and in the flat gossip of a thirsty country that other outfits in the Sweetgrass were coming up short as well, that the whole range was leaking cattle in the night, that there had not been a season of rustling like it in the memory of the oldest hands. The little outfits were losing head they could not spare. Even the Kite, men said. Even Elias Coyle's own great herds were leaking stock off the North Range, and Coyle had put the word out through the association that he would spend his last dollar to see the thieves stretched from the nearest limb, and that no honest cattleman in the Sweetgrass would rest easy until it was done. It made a kind of sense that a person wanted to believe, the way a warm lie is easier to hold than a cold truth. There was a ring of rustlers working the country, bold and organized, and every outfit large and small was their victim, and the cattlemen would band together and run them to ground, and Della Rourke, losing stock like everyone else, was simply one more honest rancher wronged. She wanted to believe it. She had a swept trail and a pinched-out smoke and a cold place in her chest that would not let her. Because there was a thing she knew that the warm lie did not account for, and it was this: her 40 head had been moved with a care that no one takes over cattle they mean simply to sell. Cattle stolen for the money are run hard and far and fast to a railhead or a crooked buyer, and the thief does not care what sign he leaves, because he means to be 3 territories away before anyone reads it. The diamond stock had been moved slow and quiet and close, and the trail had been swept. And swept trails do not lead to a railhead. Swept trails lead someplace near. Someone was taking the diamond's cattle a short way and hiding them, and taking pains that no one should be able to prove where. And a person does not hide stolen cattle nearby unless he means to do something to them before he shows them to the world. And Della Rourke, lying awake in the dark, listening to the creek run low over the crossing, turned that thought over and over and could not yet see the bottom of it, but she knew its shape was ugly. And she knew, with the certainty that had come down to her from her father, that the shape had a kite's tail on it. 2 days before the summons came, Della did a thing she rarely did anymore, which was to saddle up and ride off the diamond to call on a neighbor. Because she had come to the end of what she could learn alone, and she needed to know whether the thing she feared was only in her own head or was already abroad in the country. The nearest outfit to the diamond on the town side was a hard-scrabbled dry land place run by a stooped, leather-necked old rancher named Amos Petrie, a man who had known her father and who studied the ground a while before he studied a person, and she found him mending a corral gate in the white forenoon light. He straightened up slow when he saw who it was, and he did not smile, and in the way he did not smile she read the whole shape of what had already been said about her in that country. He was civil. He had liked her father. He gave her a dipper of water from his well, and stood with her in the thin shade of the gate, and answered her questions plainly, and what he told her turned the cold place in her chest to something harder. Yes, he was losing stock. Everyone was losing stock, worse than any season he could recall in 40 years on the flats. And yes, he said this part looking at the ground and not at her, there was talk. There was a great deal of talk in the country, and the talk had a direction to it, and the direction was the diamond. He did not credit it himself, he said, or he would not be sharing his well with her. He had known Thomas Rourke 30 years, and a straight tree does not throw a crooked shadow. But a man had been coming through, a kite man, buying nothing and selling nothing, just riding and stopping and passing the time, easy and friendly at this outfit and that, and everywhere the kite man stopped, he left the same few thoughts behind him like burrs worked into a horse's tail. Wasn't it a curious thing? The kite man would wonder aloud, how the Rourke place, poor as it was, seemed to be losing so little. Wasn't it a hard fact that the woman was alone out there with only one stove-up old hand and a bank debt the whole county knew of? Wasn't a person in a tight enough corner apt to do a thing she would never dream of doing with a full belly and money in the strongbox? He never once accused. He only wondered, friendly as you please, and then he rode on and left the wondering behind him to grow. Della stood in the old man's gateshade and listened to him lay it out in his slow, flat voice, and she understood that Elias Coyle had been salting the country against her for weeks, quiet and patient, long before she lost her first head off the upper bench. That the frame had been built in the country's mind before ever a single steer was moved, so that when the losses came the country would already know whose door to lay them at. The theft of her cattle was not the beginning of the thing. It was very near the end of it, the last stone set into a wall that had been going up around her, course by careful course, from the day a soft-voiced man first decided he meant to have her water. She thanked Amos Petrie for the water and for the truth, which was the dearer of the two, and before she rode out she asked him one thing. If it ever came to a reckoning before the whole association, would he stand up and say to the country what he had just said to her at his gate? That a straight tree does not throw a crooked shadow. The old man chewed on that a good while, looking at the ground, weighing what it might cost a hardscrabble outfit to speak for the accused against the richest neighbor in the county, and at last he said that he was too old to be scared of Elias Coyle, and getting older by the day, and that he reckoned he would say it, if it came to that. And Della rode home, knowing that in the whole wide-turning country she had one man who would open his mouth for her, and that one man was a great deal more than none, and a great deal less than she was going to need. The summons to the association meeting came on a Thursday, brought out from town by a kite rider who would not get down off his horse or take coffee, which told Della more than the folded paper did. The Sweetgrass Stock Association would convene at the town hall on Saturday to take up the matter of the rustling, and the presence of every brand holder in the country was requested, and the paper was signed in Elias Coyle's own broad hand as president. Della read it standing in the door, where her father had stood pouring coffee for the man who signed it, and she felt the 2 years since fold up and vanish, and she was aware of Griff behind her in the yard, gone very still, and of the storm-gray gelding watching her over the corral rail with his ears up as though he had read the paper too. "You going in?" Griff asked. "I'm a brand holder," Della said. "My presence is requested." The old man worked his tobacco a while. "Your father used to say a smart mouse don't accept a dinner invitation from the cat on account of the cat's good manners. My father also used to say that if you don't show up to the game, you don't get to complain how the cards fell." She folded the paper and put it away. "I'm going in, Griff. I'd rather hear what they mean to say about me to my face than get it second-hand off the freight road." "About you," the old man repeated, and it was not quite a question, and Della did not answer it, because she had heard herself say the words, and had understood in saying them the thing that had been forming in her all week, and that she had been keeping just outside the light. She was going to a meeting about the rustling, and she was going to it afraid, and a person losing stock like everyone else did not go afraid to a meeting of the wronged. She was afraid because some cold sure part of her had already worked out. From the swept trails and the black twist tobacco and the 2 years' memory of a soft voice telling her father no was only the beginning of a conversation. That the meeting was not going to be about the rustling at all. It was going to be about her. She saddled the storm-gray gelding on Saturday before light, and rode the long road into town in her one good dress, with her father's old thoughts riding alongside her the whole way, and she was right about the meeting, and it was worse than she had let herself imagine. The town was called Sabinal, and it was one dusty street of false-fronted buildings baking in the drought, and the town hall was the largest of them, and by the time Della had put the gelding up at the rail and walked in out of the white glare, it was already full of the cattlemen of the Sweetgrass and the smell of them, of sweat and tobacco and hot wool, and the particular sour excitement of a crowd that has come together to be angry at something. She knew nearly every face. She had grown up among them. Some of them had eaten at her father's table, and some of them had bought diamond stock, and one of them had carried her father's coffin on the knoll. and as she came in and found a place to stand along the wall, she watched their faces turn to her, and then turn quickly away, one after another, the way faces turn from a thing they are ashamed to be looking at, and by that alone, before a word had been said, she understood that the verdict had been reached somewhere before the trial, and that she had walked into the sentencing. Elias Coyle stood at the front behind a plain table, a broad, heavy-jowled cattleman in a fine gray broadcloth coat, a heavy gold watch chain across his vest, and a soft voice that never needed to rise. And beside him and a little behind, in the place a range boss stands, was the man whose black twist tobacco Della carried in her pocket. A lean, hatchet-faced foreman with a drooping tobacco-stained mustache, pale, close-set eyes, and a black snake whip coiled at his saddle, though the saddle was outside, and the man stood empty-handed by the table, with his pale eyes moving over the crowd and coming, again and again, back to Della along the wall. His name was Deke Mullen, and he was the range boss of the Kite. And he did not turn his face away from her the way the others did. He looked at her the whole time with a flat, pale patience that was worse than any anger, the look of a man who has already done a thing to you and is waiting, with a professional's mild interest, to watch it take. Coyle opened the meeting in his soft voice, and he was very good, and Della, who hated him and feared him, could not help a cold admiration for how good he was. He did not accuse her. That was the art of it. He stood before the angry, sweating crowd, and he spoke, gravely and reasonably, of the plague of rustling that had come upon the Sweetgrass, of good men losing the stock they had built their lives on, of his own great losses, which he mentioned modestly and in passing, so that no one could say he set himself above the small outfits in his own misfortune. He spoke of the weakness of the law in a country so far from any court, and of the old hard necessity that had always, in such country, thrown honest men back on themselves and their own rough justice when the law could not reach. He spoke of the association as the only order the Sweetgrass had, and of the duty of order to protect itself. And then, having warmed them, having gathered all their fear and anger into his soft-spoken hands like a man gathering reins, he began, very gently, to turn their faces where he wanted them turned. The rustling, he said, was not the work of some ring of strangers riding through. He had thought so at first, as they all had. But he had studied the matter, and he had come to a harder conclusion, and it grieved him to say it, but the association had not gathered to hear comfortable things. The thieves knew the country too well to be strangers. They knew where the stock watered and where it bedded, and when the riders passed. They took a few head here and a few head there, from this outfit and that, spreading their thefts so cunningly that suspicion could not settle. They were, Coyle said, someone among them. Someone at this very meeting, likely wearing the face of an honest neighbor. And the association's plain duty, however painful, was to find that someone out. Della stood very still against the wall and felt the room begin, slowly, like a great slow wheel to turn. Because Coyle had a paper, and now he unfolded it, and it was a tally. He had taken the trouble, he said, of setting down which outfits had lost stock, and how much, and there was a pattern in it that a thinking man could not ignore. The big outfits had lost head, yes, the Kite chief among them. But the big outfits had lost a smaller share of their numbers than the little outfits had, and there was one little outfit in particular that seemed, curiously, to be losing hardly anything at all when a person reckoned it against how the thieves must surely have wanted its stock. An outfit sitting square in the middle of the stolen country, on the best water in the basin. An outfit that everyone knew had fallen on hard times since the good man who built it was laid on the hill. An outfit run now by a person alone, with only one old hand. A person who, Coyle was sorry to say, would have more reason than most in the Sweetgrass to need money badly, and to know the night country well enough to take it quietly from her neighbors. He did not say her name. He did not have to. He let the pattern in the paper say it, and he let the crowd's own turning faces say it, and when at last he lifted his eyes from the tally and looked, sorrowfully, directly at Della Rourke, standing alone against the wall in her faded blue dress, the whole room turned and looked with him, and the soft voice said, gently, that he hoped very much he was wrong, and that Miss Rourke would surely want the chance to clear her good name before her neighbors, and that the association was a fair body and would hear her. It was, Della understood, standing in the sudden silence with 40 faces on her, a beautiful piece of work. He had not accused her. He had built a house of ordinary facts, each one true. She was poor. She was alone. She knew the country. She sat on the water. She had lost less than her share, and he had arranged the true facts so that the shape of the house was a gallows. And then he had stepped back and invited the crowd to notice that it was a gallows, and had washed his soft-spoken hands of having built it. And now he had handed her the floor generously, as a fair man would, and there was no answer she could give that would not sound like exactly what a guilty person would say, and he knew it, and she knew it. And the flat, pale eyes of Deke Mullen watched her from beside the table and waited to see how she would take it. Della pushed off the wall and walked to the front of the room, because a person who cowers against the wall has already confessed, and she stood beside the plain table not far from Elias Coyle, and she turned and faced the men she had known her whole life. And she found her father's steadiness somewhere and kept her voice level. She had lost stock, she said, better than 40 head, off the best water in the country, which any of them was welcome to ride out and count for himself. She had lost it the same as they had, and she resented, more than she could politely say, being made by a clever arrangement of a paper to answer for the loss as though she had caused it. She said that she had cut the sign of the men who took her cattle, that they were 2 riders at the least on shod horses, that they moved the stock slow and close and hid it near, and that they swept their trail on the hard rock in the dark, and she asked the room plainly what a rustler stealing for money wanted with a swept trail that led no farther than the next county. She said that whoever was taking the Sweetgrass cattle was not selling them, and that any man who thought a hard minute about it would want to know why, and that she for one meant to find out why, and that when she did she thought some of the faces looking at her now with such easy suspicion were going to wish they had looked a good deal harder at the man standing next to her at the front of the room. It was too much. She knew it as it left her, and she could not stop it, because it was true, and the truth had been building in her for a week. And Elias Coyle's soft face did not so much as flicker, but a low, ugly sound went through the crowd, and she understood that she had done the one thing a person in her position could least allow herself, which was to sound, in her fear and her anger, exactly like a cornered thing that means to bite. She had all but named Coyle at his own meeting in front of the whole country, on nothing a court would call proof, and the men in the room heard not a brave woman telling a hard truth, but a desperate rustler trying to throw the scent onto the richest man in the basin, and the wheel that had been turning slowly all through Coyle's soft speech came the rest of the way around in that moment, and the room hardened against her like ground going to frost. It was Deke Mullen who set the hook. He had a piece of paper of his own, and he brought it out now, unhurried, and handed it to Coyle, who read it and let his heavy face fill with a beautifully performed sorrow. It was, Coyle said, a thing he had prayed he would not have to bring forward. But 2 days past, one of his riders working the North Range had come upon a running iron, cold and hidden in the rocks at the head of a draw, cached where a man would cache the tool of his night work between uses. And the draw where it was found, Coyle said heavily, laying the paper down, ran up out of the diamond range. He was not saying the iron was Miss Rourke's. He would not say a thing he could not prove. but it was found on her ground, or as near to her ground as made a thinking man wonder, and taken together with all the rest, with the pattern in the tally and the water she sat on and the hard place she had fallen to, he thought the association would agree that there was cause, real cause, to look very closely indeed at the diamond, and that until the matter was settled no honest outfit in the Sweetgrass should buy, sell, or take in any stock wearing the diamond mark, and that Miss Rourke should hold herself ready to answer to the association, and to a harder judge than the association, if it came to that, when the proof was gathered in. A running iron. Della stood at the front of the room and understood that she had been handed, before witnesses, the very shape of the rope. A running iron is the tool a brand blotter uses, a plain straight rod heated in a fire and drawn freehand over a hide to add lines to a mark and turn one brand into another, and it is the single most damning thing a person can be tied to in cattle country. So damning that in some parts of the West the mere possession of one was reason enough for a jury of stockmen to hang a man and go home to supper without troubling the sheriff. Coyle's rider had found a running iron near her ground. It did not matter that anyone could have cached it there. It did not matter that a rustler clever enough to sweep his trail on rock would hardly be careless enough to leave his iron lying in a draw for a kite rider to stumble over. The men in the room did not want it to matter. They had come wanting a thief, and Coyle had given them one, dressed her in the true facts of her own hard luck, and set a running iron in her hand. And the thing was very nearly done. Della looked at the flat, pale, patient eyes of Deke Mullen, watching her across the plain table, and she understood at last, completely and coldly, that the man who had found the running iron near her ground and the man who had cached it there were the same man, and that she was looking at him, and that there was not one thing in the world she could presently prove. She rode home from Sabinal in the dark that night, not knowing yet how she would answer any of it, only knowing that she would, because the alternative was to bow her head and let them take the water her father had spent himself to hold, and that she would not do while she could sit a horse. She rode the storm-gray gelding at a long, steady walk under the wheel of the summer stars, and somewhere on that black road between the town and the crossing the fear that had ridden her all week began, slowly, to change into something harder and more useful, because Della Rourke had been handed by Elias Coyle, along with the rope, one thing he had not meant to give her, which was a fact. Whoever was taking the Sweetgrass cattle was hiding them near and altering them, or there would be no need for a running iron in the story at all. Coyle had reached for the running iron because the running iron was the true tool of the true crime, and in reaching for it to hang her, he had told her, without meaning to, exactly what was being done to the stolen stock and roughly where. Somewhere near, in country a person could ride to, the vanished cattle of the Sweetgrass were standing alive under altered marks, and a running iron had made the alteration, and if she could find where, and read what the iron had done, she could turn the whole beautiful machine of Coyle's making inside out. She did not sleep that night either, but for the first time in a week she lay awake building instead of only dreading, and she was up before the light, and she went to find her cattle. They came for her before she could go. She was in the corral in the gray dawn, throwing her saddle onto the storm-gray gelding, when Griff came at a stove-up run from the rise where he had gone to look at the weather, and his old face told her the news before his breath would let him say it, and she was already reaching for the rifle in the saddle scabbard when she heard what he had seen, which was riders. A bunch of them, better than a dozen, coming up the creek road out of the last of the dark at a hard trot, with the particular grim silence of men who have ridden through the night to arrive at a set hour and mean business when they get there. A posse. She had thought she would have days. She had days in her head, a plan built on days, and here in the cold dawn the days folded up to nothing, and the thing was on her already, and she stood in the corral with her hand on the rifle and made herself think. She did not take the rifle. That was the hardest single decision of her life to that hour, and she made it in the space of 3 breaths, standing in the gray light, with the storm gray gelding warm and ready under her hand, and a dozen men coming up her own road to do her harm. And she made it because her father's voice came to her out of the 2 years' silence, and told her the plainest truth he knew about the country he had chosen, which was that you cannot outshoot a mob, and the only person who ever wins a fight against a whole country is the one who makes the country ashamed of itself, and you cannot shame men you have given a reason to hate you. If she met the posse with a rifle, she was the rustler they had already decided she was, and Deke Mullen, who she did not doubt for a heartbeat was riding at the front of them, would have every excuse he could want to end the whole matter in her own corral in the gray light, with no inspector and no proof and no inconvenient questions ever asked again. She left the rifle in the scabbard. She told Griff in a low, fast voice to go up to the knoll and stay there among the graves, and to keep his hands where they could be seen, and to do nothing, whatever he saw. And the old man's face worked, and he did not want to, and she said his name once, hard. And he went, because he had followed her father, and now he followed her. And Della Rourke walked out of the corral and out into the open of her own yard in her faded blue dress, with her empty hands loose at her sides, and stood in front of the low house her father had built, and waited for the men who had brought a rope to her gate. There were 14 of them, and Deke Mullen was at the front, and behind him rode a mix of Kite men and small ranchers she knew. And one of the small ranchers had a coil of new rope on his saddle that he had not brought to gather cattle with, and Della saw it and did not look at it again, because to look at it was to grant it power. The posse came into the yard and spread into the loose half-circle that men on horseback make around a thing on the ground they mean to deal with. And Deke Mullen sat his horse in the center of the half-circle and looked down at her with his flat, pale eyes, and for a moment nobody said anything, and the creek ran, and a mourning dove called somewhere down in the cottonwoods with an awful ordinary sweetness, and Della stood in the dust of her own yard and let them look at her, and did not speak first. Because the person who speaks first in that kind of silence is the person who is afraid, and she would not give them her fear if it took the last thing she had to keep it back. It was Mullen who spoke. He said they had come for the diamond stock, all of it, to be held by the association until the matter of the rustling was settled, and that they had come for her too, to be held in town where she could be watched and questioned, and that she could come along quiet and save everyone a hard morning. Or she could make it hard. And his flat voice on the word hard had a small, awful relish in it that told Della more plainly than a signed confession that Deke Mullen was hoping, in his patient professional way, that she would make it hard. Because a woman who made it hard was a woman who could be dealt with once and finally in the confusion, and the coil of new rope on the rancher's saddle would find a use before the sun was properly up, and there would be an end to the water question that no court would ever unwind. She understood all of that in the length of his sentence, and she understood that the whole thing balanced now on her holding still. And she held still. She said, in a voice she kept level by main strength, that the association had no authority to take a brandholder's stock or her person on a rich man's say-so, and a running iron that any hand in the country could have planted, and that Josiah Pruitt was the association's own sworn brand inspector, and the only man among them with a lawful standing to say whose iron had marked what animal, and that she would give up her stock and ride to town peaceably and answer any question they cared to put to her, the moment Josiah Pruitt was standing in her yard to see it done proper and by the association's own rules. She said it loud enough for the small ranchers at the back of the half-circle to hear, the men who were not Kite men, the men who had come out of fear and anger and the herd feeling of a mob but who were not, most of them, bad men, and who had eaten at her father's table, and she watched her father's old lesson do its slow work in their faces, the lesson that you win against a country by making the country ashamed of itself. Because it was a reasonable thing she asked. It was, in fact, exactly the association's own rule. And to refuse it, to take her and her stock in the gray dawn with no inspector present, in front of the men who were not Kite men, would be to show the whole posse plainly that this was not justice, but a hanging dressed as justice, and Deke Mullen, for all his flat patience, was a range boss and not a fool. And he felt the half-circle shift behind him, felt the small ranchers hesitate, and knew that he had lost the morning. It was a near thing. Mullen sat his horse a long moment, with his pale eyes on her, weighing, Della had no doubt, whether he could push through it anyway, whether the thing could still be done fast enough that the shame would come too late. And she stood in the dust and held his eyes and did not blink, and it was one of the small ranchers at the back, an old dryland man named Amos Petrie, who had known her father, who broke it, who said in a grumbling, uneasy voice that the woman was right, that it was the rule, that he'd not be party to taking anybody, man or woman, without Josiah Pruitt there, to do it lawful, and that he'd come to help catch a rustler, and not to help hang a neighbor on a rich man's word, and there was a low mutter of others agreeing, and the half-circle came apart at the edges, and the morning was saved. Mullen gave her one last flat look that promised the matter was not finished, and he wheeled his horse, and he told the posse that they would hold the diamond stock where it stood, and post riders on the water and send to town for Pruitt, and that Miss Rourke would keep to her house and her yard and understand that she was watched, and that when the inspector came the truth would come with him. And God help the guilty. And they took her cattle up onto the bench and threw a loose guard around the crossing, Kite men mostly, and Deke Mullen rode off to town himself to fetch Josiah Pruitt, and Della Rourke was left standing in her own yard in the risen sun, alive, her stock held but not gone, her water guarded but not lost, with perhaps 2 days before the inspector came, and 2 days. She thought, watching the dust of Mullen's going, was not nothing. 2 days was a great deal, to a person who could ride and read sign, and had the finest horse the diamond ever raised, standing saddled in the corral. She had asked for Pruitt to buy the time, and she had bought it, and now she meant to spend it finding the thing that would make Josiah Pruitt's honest eye do to Elias Coyle what Coyle had meant it to do to her. Before she did anything else, she walked up to the knoll. She had sent Griff there in the gray dawn to keep him clear of the guns, and she found him there still in the risen morning. The stove-up old man sitting patient among the graves, with his hat in his rope-scarred hands, keeping a kind of watch over the 2 markers, as though the men who had ridden in might have meant harm even to those. There were 2 graves on the knoll above the crossing. Her father was under the newer one. Her mother, whom Della scarcely remembered, was under the older, and the grass had long since healed over that one, the way grass heals over everything given time. And Thomas Rourke had liked to say that the knoll was the one piece of the diamond he was in no hurry to add to. Della stood between the 2 markers in the hard, clean light, with the old hand beside her, and the guarded waters shining below them, and the storm-gray gelding cropping grass at the foot of the slope. And she did not weep, because she had done her weeping in the first weeks and had none of it left over to spend. But she stood a while and let the place say to her what it always said. Her father had come into this country with nothing but a borrowed horse and a way of reading ground, and he had found the diamond in the dust and closed his hand on it and held it against everything the country could throw, drought and debt and hard men, for the whole of a life, and had handed it on to her clean. He had not handed it on so that she could let it go the first time a rich man reached for it. Griff worked his tobacco and looked down at the water and said, in his slow way, that Thomas would have known what to do. And Della said that Thomas had already told her what to do, years back, on a dozen long rides, and that she had only to remember it. And the old man nodded as though that were the truth, which it was. The prairie gives you dust in the one hand and a diamond in the other. She had spent a year learning that the giving was not the end of it, that once in a great while the prairie would try to take the diamond back out of your closed fist by main force and by lie, and that the art her father had never quite gotten around to naming was the art of not letting it, of keeping your fingers shut on the one true thing through everything that came to pry them open. She meant to keep her fingers shut. She told the old man so, standing between the graves, and Griff looked at her a long moment, and then said that he had known her father a great many years, and had never once seen the man look more like himself than she looked to him right now. And it was the finest thing anyone had said to her in the whole hard year, and it steadied her better than a night's sleep would have. She waited until the deep of the night, when the kite riders posted on the crossing had built their fire and settled to it, and the long day's tension had loosened them into low talk and cards. And then she took the storm gray gelding out the back of the corral on foot, with his hooves muffled in sacking she had tied on by feel in the dark. And she led him up the dry wash behind the house, where the cutbank hid them both, and she did not mount until she was over the rise and out of sight and sound of the fire, and then she swung up onto the 17 hands of storm-colored horse, and pointed him north into the country where her cattle had gone, and the gelding went out into the dark eager and quiet, as though he had understood every word of the plan, which in the way of a great horse, and the person who is his one person, he very nearly had. The moon was 3 days off the full, and gave her light enough. She rode north by the swept trail she had found that first morning, and where the swept trail gave out she rode by the country itself, by the lay of the land and the run of the draws, and the reading her father had put into her. Because stolen cattle moved slow and quiet and hidden go the way the land wants to take them, down the easy grades and along the soft bottoms and through the gaps. And a tracker who cannot see the trail can still often ride the country the trail must have taken and pick the sign up again on the far side. She rode all that night, cutting for sign at every soft place, and twice she lost it, and twice the land gave it back to her. And as the country lifted toward the broken breaks under the Rinken rim, the sign grew easier rather than harder, because the men who had swept the open flats had not troubled to sweep the rocky breaks where they thought no one would ever follow. And by the false dawn Della Rourke was deep in country she had not been in since she was small, hard-broken country of red rock and cedar and blind draws that pinched down to nothing, the kind of country a whole herd could be lost in and never found by anyone who did not already know the way. And there, in the pearl light before the sun, she found the way. Because 100 head of cattle moved through even the hardest country in the dark leave, a road for a person who can read one. And the road ran straight and sure into the mouth of a canyon she had half forgotten. A deep box canyon in the Rinken breaks that the old-timers had called the Blind Canyon, because it had one narrow mouth and no other way out. A stone bag with a floor of good hidden grass and a seep of water in the back of it, and Della sat the storm gray gelding in the cedars above the mouth of the Blind Canyon in the first gray light, and looked down and saw, standing quiet and slick and healthy on the hidden grass below her, a great many cattle that were not supposed to exist. She did not ride down. She sat in the cedars a long time in the growing light, and she watched, and she counted, and she made herself understand what she was looking at before she let herself feel anything about it. There were several hundred head on the floor of the Blind Canyon, far more than the diamond had lost, cattle of every outfit in the Sweetgrass, gathered here in one hidden herd on hidden grass, all of them standing easy and fat and sound, which was the first thing that struck her, and the thing she came back to later as the strangest of all, that whoever was running this had taken great care to keep the stolen stock in good flesh and good health, penned in the one-box canyon in the breaks with grass and water, not run down or driven hard, but held, gently almost, held and fed and watered and kept for their marks. Because as the sun came up over the Rincon rim and threw its first low gold across the canyon floor, Della, watching from the cedars, with her heart going hard and slow, began to be able to see the cattle's brands, and even at that distance, even in that first light, she could see that something had been done to them, that the marks on the near stalk did not read clean the way an honest brand reads, that they carried a thickness, a doubling, a wrongness in the mark that a person who had read 1,000 honest brands could feel before she could rightly say what it was. And she understood that she was looking at the thing the running iron had made, the thing the swept trails had been protecting, the heart of the machine, and that she had 2 days at most before Josiah Pruitt came to her yard, and that somehow in those 2 days she had to get the honest inspector to look at what she was looking at, or the box canyon would be emptied, and the stock scattered and the grass burned over and the whole thing gone as though it had never been, and it would be her neck in the new rope after all. She waited for full light, and then she did the thing she had come to do, which was to ride down into the blind canyon and read a brand with her own eyes and hands, and it was the most dangerous single thing she had done in her life, and she did it slowly and carefully in the early light, while the canyon was still empty of men. Riding the storm-gray gelding quietly along the base of the wall, in the shadow where the sun had not yet reached, working her way toward the nearest bunch of the strange marked stock. The cattle let her come. They were gentle with the particular gentleness of stock that has been handled patiently and kept easy, and she picked out a heavy steer, standing a little apart. And she came up on him slow and easy, talking low, and the steer turned his head and looked at her with the mild, wet eyes of a well-kept animal, and did not spook, and Della Rourke leaned down from the 17 hands of storm-gray horse, and looked at the brand on the steer's left hip in the low gold light, and read it, and felt the whole world turn over. It was a kite. A clean, heeled old kite, the 4-cornered figure with the straight tail dropping from the lower point, the registered mark of the biggest outfit in the Sweetgrass, Elias Coyle's own iron. And it was a lie. Della had read 10,000 brands in her life, and she knew in the first held breath of looking that the kite on the steer's hip was not 1 mark but 2, an old mark and a new one. A truth and a lie burned one over the other, because the diamond part of the figure, the 4-cornered body of it, had healed pale and smooth and flat, hair grown back fine over an old scar year's cool, while the tail, the single straight stroke dropping from the lower point that turned an honest diamond into a kite, stood up fresh and proud and angry. A raised welt of new healing hide, with the hair growing back over it white, and curled the way hair grows over a mark only weeks old. The body of the brand was years old. The tail was a month old. And no honest iron in the world puts a fresh tail on a years-old diamond, because an honest man brands his stock all at once, when they are calves, and never touches the mark again. And the only reason under heaven that a brand comes to have an old body and a new tail is that someone took an animal wearing an old honest 4-cornered diamond, and with a running iron drew 1 fresh stroke down from the lower point, and turned another outfit's diamond into his own kite. She straightened up off the first steer, with her heart slamming, and made herself look at a second, and a third, easing the storm-gray gelding from bunch to bunch along the shadowed wall, and every one told the same tale, an old pale diamond healed years cool, and dropping fresh from its lower point the angry new welt of a month-old tail. And then she came on one she knew. He was a big line-backed steer with a notch out of his near ear, where a cedar snag had caught it when he was a spring calf 2 years gone. A diamond steer she had doctored herself and turned loose sound, and she would have known him among 10,000, and he stood there now on the hidden grass wearing a kite, her own steer. The diamond she had watched her own hands iron set on his hip, buried alive under Elias Coyle's fresh tail. It was one thing to reason a crime out cold from swept trails and pinched out smokes. It was another thing entirely to sit her horse in a stone canyon at sunrise, and lay her palm on the warm hide of an animal she had raised, and feel under her fingers the ridge of the lie that had been drawn across his side to make him another man's property, and to make her a thief. For one moment the anger came up in Della Rourke so hard and so hot that it frightened her worse than the men who might be coming, because she understood in that moment exactly how a person came to want the rough, dark kind of justice her father had spent his life warning her against, and understood at the same time that she could not have it, that the only justice that would hold was the slow, cold, lawful kind, and that she was going to have to master the thing rising in her and ride out of here quiet and prove it by the book, or lose everything to her own righteous fury. She mastered it. It was the hardest holding still of the whole affair, harder than the yard had been, and she did it. And she gentled the notch-eared steer with a hand and a low word, as though he were the one who needed calming, and maybe he was, and maybe they both were. They were not stealing Coyle's cattle. Coyle was stealing everyone's. And where the stolen mark had been a diamond, he was not even bothering to blot it past reading. He was simply adding his tail to it and calling the animal his own. Because a diamond with a tail added is a kite, exact and perfect, no clumsy blotch about it, the neatest alteration in all the register, and Della Rourke, sitting the storm gray gelding in the low gold light of the blind canyon, with her hand on a stolen steer's warm hide, understood at last, whole and entire, the terrible cleverness of the thing that had been done to her. Her father had chosen the diamond because it was the simplest honest shape a running iron could not easily turn into a lie. He had been half right, and his half-rightness was the trap. A diamond could not be turned into most other brands without clumsy blotching that any inspector would catch. But there was one brand in all the Sweetgrass that a diamond could be turned into with a single clean stroke and no blotch at all. One brand that was nothing more than a diamond with a tail, and that brand was the Kite, and Elias Coyle held it. And had held it for years, and Della saw now with a cold-falling certainty that he had perhaps chosen it, or kept it, for exactly this, that a man who ran a kite in a country full of little diamond and diamond kin outfits held in his registered iron a lawful engine for turning any of their stock into his with one honest-looking stroke, and had only been waiting for a drought to make the water worth the trouble. He was not hiding the diamond's cattle to hold them for ransom. He was converting them. Every head of diamond stock in the blind canyon was being quietly and lawfully, that was the horror of it, turned into kite stock, one clean tail at a time, and once the tails had healed, and the hair grown back, and a season or two had passed to cool the new scars to match the old, there would be no diamond left in the Sweetgrass at all, only kites, hundreds of them, wearing Elias Coyle's honest registered iron, and no inspector in the world could say they had ever been anything else. And the running iron cached near her ground, and the swept trails, and the soft speech at the association, and the pattern in the tally, all of it was there for one purpose only, to make sure that when the diamond outfit finally cried theft, the country would already have decided that the diamond was the den of thieves, so that Della Rourke would answer at a rope's end for the rustling of her own stolen cattle, and Elias Coyle would buy the crossing on Wolf Creek from the county at auction for back taxes, with the whole Sweetgrass thanking him for ridding it of a thief. She understood it all in one long breath in the gold light, with her hand on the steer, and the understanding was so large and so cold and so complete that for a moment she could not move. And then she heard, from the mouth of the canyon behind her, the sound of a horse and a man's low voice, and she came back into her body all at once, and knew that the morning's grace was over, and the men had come to their work, and that she was alone and unproven, in a stone bag with one mouth, in among several hundred head of another man's stolen cattle, with the man himself or his hatchet-faced range boss between her and the only way out. What saved her was the horse, and the shadow, and the reading of country her father had put into her bones. She did not run, because a horse breaking cover at a run in a stone canyon is a horse the whole world hears, and Deke Mullen at the mouth of the blind canyon would have had her cold. She turned the storm gray gelding with the least pressure of her hand, a thing she could do because he was the finest horse the diamond ever raised, and answered her like her own breath. And she walked him quiet and slow deeper into the canyon, into the blue shadow along the base of the wall where the risen sun had not yet reached, moving away from the voices at the mouth, and she rode the shadow the way she had ridden it coming in, a piece of the coming weather drifting along a stone wall, and she got the whole length of the blind canyon between herself and the men. And she found, at the blind back of it where the seep rose, the thing she had prayed the country would give her, which was a cattle trail, an old faint one, going up. Stock had climbed out of the back of the blind canyon in some far year when the seep ran fuller, up a broken ramp of rock a man on the ground would have called no way at all, and Della Rourke got down off the storm gray gelding and led him up it on foot in the blue shadow, with her heart going like a hammer, up the broken ledges hand and hoof. The great horse scrambling and lunging and trusting her, and the men's voices small behind her at the mouth of the canyon. And near the top a rock turned and rang down the ramp behind them with a sound like a struck bell. And a voice below shouted, and Della threw herself the last of the way up over the rim hauling on the reins. And the storm gray gelding came up behind her with a heave that nearly took them both back down, and then they were over, out, up on the high broken rim of the breaks in the full risen sun, and she was on his back and gone into the cedars before the first rider reached the bottom of the ramp, and she rode the high country home by ways no kite man knew. And behind her she left the blind canyon and the men, and the several hundred head of gentle stolen stock standing fat and sound on the hidden grass with one fresh tail apiece, healing on their stolen hides. And she carried away with her the one thing that could break Elias Coyle, which was that she now knew, whole and entire, exactly what he had done and exactly how to prove it. And she had. If she was very lucky and rode very hard, perhaps a day and a half to do it in. She came down off the breaks in the middle of the day and lay up in a cedar draw to rest the storm gray gelding, because a horse ridden into the ground proves nothing and saves no one, and while he grazed and blew she sat in the thin shade and made herself think it through cold, the way her father had taught her to think a hard thing through from the far end backward. What did she have? She had the truth, whole and entire. She had no paper, no witness but herself, and the word of a woman the whole country had decided was a rustler. The stolen stock stood in the blind canyon, but the blind canyon was Coyle's, guarded, and by the time she could bring anyone to it the stock would be gone, scattered or driven off over the rim, and the grass burned to hide the sign, and she knew it. What she had that could not be moved or burned or scattered was the thing itself, the alteration, the old diamond body and the fresh kite tail, the 2 ages of scar on one animal. And that thing was carried on the hides of hundreds of head, and could not be undone, and would read the same to any honest eye that knew how to look, and there was exactly one honest eye in the Sweetgrass, with the lawful standing to look and be believed, and his name was Josiah Pruitt. And he was riding at this moment toward her own yard to sit in judgment on her, brought there by Deke Mullen himself. That was the pivot the whole thing turned on, and Della saw it clear in the cedar shade, and it was so simple and so dangerous that she laughed out loud once, a short hard sound with no fun in it. Coyle's own machine required an honest inspector. That was its single flaw, the price of its cleverness. To hang Della lawfully, to take the crossing lawfully, Coyle needed the association's sworn brand inspector to come and pronounce the diamond guilty, because Coyle's whole art was to do everything by the rules so that no one could ever unwind it, and the rules said the inspector read the iron. He was counting on Josiah Pruitt to look at the planted running iron and the pattern in the tally and the desperate lone woman, and to read the obvious guilty story. But an honest inspector is honest in both directions. The same sworn eye that could be aimed at Della could be aimed at the blind canyon, and the same rules that made Pruitt's word enough to hang her made his word enough to break Coyle. And the one thing Coyle could not do, the one move his whole clever lawful machine forbade him, was to be rid of Josiah Pruitt, because a rustling settled by the association without its own inspector was a rustling. The whole country would smell. Coyle had to use Pruitt, and Della, if she could reach Pruitt first, or reach him true, could turn the honest eye the other way and bring the whole thing down. She had to get to the inspector before Mullen filled his head, or failing that, she had to make the inspector do the one thing an honest inspector cannot refuse to do, which is to go and look for himself. She rested the horse until the worst of the day's heat had passed, and then she rode for home, not fast now, but steady and saving. A long ground-eating traveling walk and trot, that the storm-gray gelding could hold from noon to dark, and she came down toward the crossing on Wolf Creek in the last hour of light, with a plan that was mostly nerve and one honest man's character. And the getting home taught her that the easy half of any hard thing is generally the half a person has already done. Twice on the open flats that afternoon, she cut the fresh sign of riders quartering the country, kite men strung out in a loose line, and sweeping the range the way men sweep for a thing they mean to find, and she did not have to be told what they were sweeping for. Deke Mullen had not sat idle by the crossing fire while she rode north. He had guessed or been told by a posted rider that the diamond woman was loose in the country instead of keeping to her yard as she had been bid, and he had put men out to bring her in, and a storm-gray horse near 17 hands is not an easy thing to hide on open ground in the flat afternoon light. Both times she saw their dust standing in the still air before they could have seen hers, because she was looking for them and they were only riding, and both times she took the storm-gray gelding down off the skyline into a wash or behind a swell of ground, and held him there with a hand flat on his neck and her own breath held, while the riders passed within a stone's throw and never turned their heads, and both times the great horse stood under her hand, as still as the ground itself, ears up, patient, as though he understood that stillness was the whole of the game now, and meant to be better at it than any man hunting them. It cost her hours she could ill spare, and a wide swing south off her line, that laid extra miles on a horse she had already asked far too much of, and the sun was well down the western sky by the time she came at last through the broken country above the crossing, and looked down on her own place from the cedars. And what she saw there stopped the breath in her, because she had lost a race she had not known she was running. There were horses at her own rail that were not hers, and a thin thread of wood smoke standing straight up from a fire in her own yard in the still evening air, and it came to her all at once and cold, that while she had spent the daylight dodging Mullen's sweep out on the flats, Mullen himself had gone and done the very thing her whole plan had been built to get ahead of. He had already brought the inspector in. She left the storm-gray gelding in the cottonwoods well below the house, and went up the last of the way on foot in the gathering dusk, keeping to the willows along the creek. And from the deep shadow there she looked into her own yard, and made out 3 horses at the rail that were not hers, and a low fire burning and men around it, and she picked out among them, in the moving firelight, the one man she had ridden a day and a half of hard country to reach. Josiah Pruitt was a spare, gray, bearded brand inspector, with a stockman's squint, a tally book buttoned in his coat, and a reputation for reading an iron no man could lie to. And he sat a little apart from the fire on a keg with his coffee, an old man and a careful one, and near him, standing, was the hatchet-faced shape of Deke Mullen, and Della understood that Mullen had brought Pruitt in, and meant to keep him close and keep his earful the whole time until the reading was done, so that the honest inspector would never hear any story but Coyle's. It was well played, and it very nearly worked, and what undid it in the end was a small thing, the smallest thing. A thing so slight that Della hesitated on the edge of the willows a long moment, wondering if she dared stake her neck on it. And staked her neck on it, because it was all she had. Josiah Pruitt was sitting apart from the fire. An old inspector who had thrown in with Coyle, who was in the thing, who meant to read the story the way he'd been paid to read it. Sits at the fire with the range boss and laughs at his jokes. An old inspector who sits apart with his coffee and his own thoughts, a little away from the Kite man's easy talk, is an old inspector who is not comfortable, who has questions he is keeping to himself, who has been a straight man too long to be easy in a crooked camp. Della had one card, and it was Josiah Pruitt's discomfort, and she had to play it without Mullen seeing, and she settled into the willows to wait for the one moment the whole thing needed, which was the inspector alone. It came near midnight. The fire burned down, and the coffee ran out, and men are men. Deke Mullen and the two kite riders with him bedded down at last in the yard by the coals. And Josiah Pruitt, who was old and slept poorly as old men do, got up after a while from his blankets and walked out a little way from the sleeping camp toward the corral, to look at the stars and be for a moment alone with the night. And Della Rourke came up out of the dark at the corral rail so quiet that the old man startled and reached for a gun he was too honest to be wearing. And she said his name low and fast before he could call out, and she said one sentence into the dark that she had spent the whole ride home shaping. One sentence that she gambled would hold an honest man where 100 pleas would have sent him shouting for Mullen. She said, "I have not come to run, Mr. Pruitt, and I will stand your reading tomorrow, whatever it says. But before you read one iron on this place, I am asking you as a sworn inspector to ride 2 hours north with me to the blind canyon in the breaks and read what is standing there. And if what is standing there is not the worst thing you have seen in 40 years of reading iron, you can put the rope on me yourself." It was the right sentence. She knew at the instant it was out, because Josiah Pruitt did not call out, and did not step back, but stood very still in the dark with his old head cocked, weighing her, an inspector to the bone, weighing the woman and the offer, and the way of the offer, and Della held her breath and let him weigh her, because she had given him the one thing that an honest inspector cannot walk away from, which is a witness offering, freely and at her own risk, to be taken to the evidence. A guilty person does not lead the inspector to the herd. A guilty person runs, or lies, or stands on her rights. Only an innocent one, or a very great fool, offers to ride the inspector straight to the thing itself and let it speak, and Josiah Pruitt had read enough guilt in 40 years to know the sound of its opposite, and he stood in the dark a long time, and then he said, very low in a dry old voice, that he had wondered, he did not mind telling her, why a rustling this size left such a wide, clumsy trail to one lone woman's door and such a clean one everywhere else, and that a thing that read too easy had always, in his experience, been a thing someone wanted read, and that he was an old man and did not care to be anyone's easy answer, and that he would ride north with her, now, in the dark, before Mullen woke, and look at what she wanted him to see, and that heaven have mercy on her if she had lied to him, because he would put the rope on her himself, and mean it. They rode out of the sleeping camp on foot leading the horses, the old inspector on his own animal, and Della on the storm gray gelding. And they were over the rise, and gone north into the dark, before Deke Mullen turned in his blankets by the cold fire, and Della Rourke set the pace as fast as the old man could hold through the night country, back up the long way she had come. And somewhere in the black hours of that ride, she stopped being a hunted woman leading a doubtful inspector, and became, without either of them saying so, two straight people riding together toward a thing that needed straightening, and the storm gray gelding carried her through it tireless, and sure as though he knew that this was the ride the whole year had been coming to. They came up into the breaks in the false dawn for the second time in 2 days, and Della brought Josiah Pruitt not down the guarded mouth of the blind canyon, but around by the high broken ramp at its back, the way she had come out, and they left the horses on the rim and went down the last of it on foot in the pearl light. The old inspector climbing stiff and game down the broken ledges with his tally book buttoned in his coat, and they came out at the blind back of the canyon among the seep willows just as the sun came up over the Rincon rim and threw its first low gold across the floor of the blind canyon and lit, standing fat and gentle and sound on the hidden grass. Several hundred head of stolen cattle wearing their fresh, clean, lawful lie. Josiah Pruitt stood among the willows in the gold light and looked at the herd for a long moment without a word. An old man who had read iron for 40 years, looking at the biggest and cleverest cattle theft of his life, and then he took his tally book out of his coat and licked his thumb and turned to a clean page, and he said, in a dry, flat voice, with something terrible waking under it, that they had best get to work before the light got high, and would Miss Rourke be so kind as to walk him quiet to the nearest bunch and hold each animal she could while he read it, and that he would want to see, he thought, a good many of them before he was done, because a thing this size he did not mean to hang on 1 steer or 10, but on so many that no lawyer Elias Coyle could buy in the territory would be able to stand up in a court and call it a mistake. And Della Rourke, who had ridden 2 days and better on nerve, and one departed man's teaching to bring an honest eye to this hidden place, walked the sworn inspector of the Sweetgrass Stock Association out into the gold light among the stolen cattle. And one by one in the risen sun she gentled the heavy stock to standing, and held them by feel and word the way her father had taught her, and one by one Josiah Pruitt bent his gray head, and put his old sure eye on their hides, and read them, and made his marks. He read the truth the same on every one. An old diamond, healed pale and cool and years quiet, the 4-cornered honest mark of a small outfit, and burned down from the lower point of it, fresh and proud and only weeks old, a single straight tail, the one clean stroke of a running iron that turned a diamond into a kite. Old body. New tail. 2 ages of scar on one honest animal, and no possible reason on the earth for it but the reason Della had read the first morning with her hand on the steer, that Coyle's men had gathered the stock of every small outfit in the Sweetgrass and drawn one lawful tail on each and made them kites. And Pruitt found the thing besides that Della, who was a tracker and not an inspector, had not known to look for, the thing that turned the reading from damning into unanswerable, and he showed it to her on the 3rd animal with a grim old satisfaction. When cattle are honestly sold from one outfit to another, he said, the seller vents his brand, burns a bar across the old mark to cancel it, so any inspector can see the animal changed hands lawful, and the old iron is void. It is the law of the range, and the first thing an inspector looks for. And not one head in the blind canyon carried a vent. Not one. Every animal wore a live diamond with a kite's tail run onto it, and no vent bar anywhere. Which meant that not one of these several hundred head had ever been sold to the Kite by anybody, that every last one had been taken and altered and never bought, and that the fresh tails were not the record of a sale, but the signature of a theft, hundreds of times over, each one a confession burned by Coyle's own men into Coyle's own registered iron. There was no unwinding it. There was no lawyer for it. An old honest inspector had read it with his own eye and set it down in his own tally book, animal by animal by animal. And Josiah Pruitt worked the sunlit floor of the blind canyon for better than 2 hours in the rising heat, reading and marking, until he had a tally of the alteration too long and too plain for any court in any territory to wave aside. And when he was done, he closed the tally book and buttoned it back into his coat, and stood a while looking out over the several hundred. Gentle stolen animals in the hard bright light, with an expression Della never forgot, the still cold fury of a straight man who has been very nearly made a crooked one's tool, and he said quietly that in 40 years he had never seen the like, and that Elias Coyle had made one mistake in all his cleverness, which was to build a lie that could only be finished by an honest man, and to send for him to finish it. And then the guards found them. They had known the risk, and it came the way they had known it would. Riders at the mouth of the blind canyon in the high morning, kitemen posted on the stolen herd, and one of them working up along the wall spotted the two figures among the seep willows at the blind back of the canyon where no one was supposed to be able to get, and a shout went up and rang off the stone walls. And Della saw across the whole length of the sunlit canyon floor the small figures of men swinging up onto horses, and she got Josiah Pruitt moving up the broken ramp ahead of her faster than an old man should climb, hauling him by the coat over the bad places, the tally book that could break Elias Coyle buttoned safe against the old inspector's chest. And behind and below them, the kite riders reached the bottom of the ramp and could not bring their horses up it, and had to come on foot, and it was a race up the broken ledges in the hard morning sun. An old man and a rangy woman scrambling for the rim with the proof, and the storm gray gelding, and the inspector's horse waiting on the rim where they had left them, and the kitemen climbing hard below, with the particular silent purpose of men who understand that the thing getting away from them up the rocks is the one thing in the world that can undo their master. Della got Pruitt to the top and threw him up onto his horse and swung up onto the 17 hands of Storm Gray horse, and the first kite man came over the rim behind them, clawing for his belt gun. And Della did not wait to see the rest. She got the inspector's horse by the headstall and hauled it around and pointed both animals down off the rim into the broken high country, and asked the storm gray gelding for everything he had. And he gave it, the finest horse the diamond ever raised, gave it the way he had given it on the ramp, and carried her and pulled the old man's slower horse along in his wake, down through the cedars and the red rock by ways no kite man knew, and behind them the shouting fell away, and the country closed around them, and they were gone, out of the breaks and down onto the open flats in the full morning, with 2 hours hard riding between them and any pursuit, and the tally book that ended Elias Coyle, riding safe in an honest old man's coat. They did not go to the diamond. Della saw the danger of it in the same moment Pruitt said it aloud, that Deke Mullen would have waked at the cold fire to find the inspector gone in the night, and the woman gone with him, and would know, being no fool, exactly where they had gone and exactly what it meant, and would be moving already, and that the diamond yard was the first place he would put men. They went instead the long way around to Sabinal, to the town, and they rode into the one dusty street in the middle of the day with the sun hammering down, and Josiah Pruitt did not go to the association or to Coyle, but to the small adobe office of the county's one weary deputy, and to the storekeeper who kept the association's brand register locked in his back room. And he laid the whole thing out in his dry, flat inspector's voice, the tally book open on the counter, animal by animal, old diamond body and fresh kite tail and never a vent among the lot of them. And he sent a rider that same hour on the best horse in town for the territorial marshal 2 days east, and he stood in the store with the register open to Elias Coyle's registered Kite and Thomas, Rourke's registered diamond side by side, and showed the gathering, muttering, disbelieving men of Sabinal the one plain thing that no soft speech could talk them out of once they had seen it, which was that a kite was a diamond with a tail, and that there were several hundred fresh tails standing in a box canyon in the breaks with no vents under them, and that the woman they had come within an ace of hanging had been telling them the flat truth from the first, and that the man who had spun them the beautiful patient lie was the biggest cattle thief in the history of the Sweetgrass country. The word ran through Sabinal and out along the freight road faster than any horse, the way the true word does when it finally comes. And the country turned. All at once, the whole slow wheel of it coming around the other way. Because there is nothing a wronged and frightened people turn on so hard as the one who made a fool of their fear. By evening the small ranchers who had ridden in Deke Mullen's posse were standing in the street of Sabinal white-faced and shaken at what they had nearly done and loud, now in their fury at the man who had nearly made them do it. By evening the association that Elias Coyle had built into the very law of the Sweetgrass had come apart in his hands like wet paper, its members falling over themselves to be counted against him, and the honest tally in Josiah Pruitt's book had gone from a rope around Della Rourke's neck to a rope around Coyle's, though the rope stayed, in the end, a lawful one, because Della Rourke had learned her father's hardest lesson too well by then to want it any other way. She did not want Elias Coyle strung from a limb in the dark by a mob, however much some in Sabinal by nightfall wanted to give her that. She wanted him broken the way he had tried to break her, in the light, by the rules, by the honest tally, with the whole country watching and ashamed, and that was the way it went. The territorial marshal came in 2 days, riding a lathered horse, and he heard Josiah Pruitt out, and he rode to the blind canyon with the inspector and a dozen sworn men, and found the several hundred heads still standing on the hidden grass. Because Deke Mullen, waking to a ruined world, had run rather than tried the hopeless work of scattering and hiding a canyon full of the very evidence that would hang his master, and had run. In the end, not far. Because a country roused turns every hand against a fleeing man, and they took Deke Mullen on the 3rd day at a line camp in the breaks with the running iron itself in his saddle roll, the actual tool, the plain straight rod with the working end burned bright, the twin of the one he had catched near the diamond to hang an innocent woman. And they took him with the mark on his right hand that every man who works a running iron freehand carries sooner or later, the pale old burn scar that is the inspector's tell of the trade. And Deke Mullen, looking at the rope at last from the wrong side of it, did the thing such men do, and talked, and told it all to save his own neck, the whole patient design of it, and named Elias Coyle the head and the hand and the purse of every bit of it, and the crossing on Wolf Creek the whole reason and the prize. They arrested Elias Coyle at his own headquarters under the Kite that had been the engine of his cleverness, a broad, heavy-jowled cattleman in a fine gray broadcloth coat, a heavy gold watch chain across his vest, and a soft voice that never needed to rise. And the soft voice did him no good at all in the end, because there is no speech soft enough to talk a country out of a thing it has seen with its own eyes in an honest inspector's tally book, and Elias Coyle went east in irons to the territorial court to answer for the biggest brand fraud the West had seen, and the great Kite outfit came apart at auction to pay what he owed the outfits he had. Robbed, and the several hundred head of stolen stock were sorted out in a month of patient work by Josiah Pruitt, and given back, old diamond by old diamond, and every other honest iron, to the outfits they had been taken from, and 40-some head of them, slick and sound and gentle, wearing an old-heeled diamond with a fresh false tail that would fade in a season, came home at last up the creek road to the crossing on Wolf Creek and the good grass and the low house under the cottonwoods, to the ranch her father had built and named for the day he found the water. Della Rourke was cleared before the whole country by the same association and the same inspector that had so nearly hanged her. And the clearing was made as public and as plain as the accusation had been, because Josiah Pruitt, who was a just man, and had come close to being made an unjust one, would have it no other way, and stood up in the town hall at Sabinal, where Coyle had built his gallows of true facts, and read out his tally book to the same crowd, and told them, flat and dry, exactly how near they had come to hanging the one honest party in the whole affair, and let them sit in it. And the country, which had turned on her so easily, turned back, as a country does, and there were men who had looked away from her along the wall of that first meeting, who came now to the diamond hat in hand, to say what they had not had the character to say before, and Della heard them out at her father's door, where she had stood to be accused, and poured them coffee, and forgave the ones worth forgiving, because her father had taught her that a person carries the country she lives in, whether she likes it or no, and that there is more profit in being the kind of neighbor you wish you had than in nursing a just grudge until it eats you hollow. She was in Sabinal the day they brought Elias Coyle down, out of the Kite country, to answer for it, because Josiah Pruitt had asked her to be, saying that the woman the man had tried to hang ought by rights to be standing in the light when the country got its first clear look at him in the wrong. She stood in the dusty street among the same neighbors who had turned their faces from her along the wall of the town hall, and she watched the marshal's party come in with the heavy, soft-spoken man riding in their midst, and for a moment, as they brought him past her, Elias Coyle turned his heavy head and found her face in the crowd, and the soft voice tried, one last time, the only trick it had ever needed. He said, gently, pleasantly, as though the two of them were the only reasonable people in a street full of fools, that it was a great pity, all of it, a great misunderstanding that clever lawyers would surely untangle in time, and that a sensible woman with a debt-ridden little outfit might yet do very well for herself by remembering that the Kite had many friends and a long memory, and that these present troubles would blow over like weather. It was the same soft, reasonable voice that had built a gallows out of true facts, and very nearly stood her beneath it, and Della looked back at him and did not raise her own voice either, because she was her father's own, and had learned that the strongest thing a person can do to a soft-spoken liar is to answer him quieter than he speaks. She said only that the brands would be read in open court by an honest man, the same as they had been read in the canyon, and that there was not a lawyer born who could talk an old-heeled diamond into being anything but exactly what it was, and that he had made his one mistake the day he chose for his iron a mark a body could add a line to, instead of one that could not be added to at all, and that she hoped he had a long, quiet time coming in which to think that over. And the soft voice did not find anything to say to that, and they took him on down the street, and the whole country watched him go, and that was the last word that ever passed between Della Rourke and Elias Coyle. She did not go soft on the ones who did not deserve it. She was her father's own to the bone, and she remembered who had brought the new rope to her gate, and who had spoken for her at the back of the half-circle, and the Sweetgrass remembered that she remembered, and the diamond was let alone by the kind of man who lets a hard woman alone, ever after. The crossing on Wolf Creek stayed the diamonds, and the waters saw the ranch through that dry year and the next, and when the rains at last came back to the Sweetgrass country, and the creeks ran full, and the grass came up to a horse's knees, the diamond stock, slick and sound and famous now for the story that hung on them, brought top prices at every sale, because there is no advertisement in the world like a true tale of a wrong put right. And the whole territory wanted a diamond-branded animal off the ranch of the woman who had read the altered brands and broken the cattle king, and Della Rourke, who had come within a rope's length of losing everything, found herself at the far end of it, with the best-known small outfit in the West and a water right no man in the country would ever again be fool enough to reach for. But that was later. On the evening it was truly over, the evening the marshal took Elias Coyle east, and the last of the stolen diamond stock came home up the creek road, Della Rourke did the thing she had done at the start of this account, and did every evening of her life when the world would let her, which was to ride out to the bench above the crossing on Wolf Creek at the last hour of light on the finest horse, the diamond ever raised. Griff came up from the bunkhouse to watch her go, a stove-up, bow-legged old rider, white-whiskered and slow to speak, whose rope-scarred hands could still gentle any horse on the place, and he did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying between them any more that the year had not already said, and he lifted one old scarred hand as she rode out, and she lifted hers. And she took the storm gray gelding up onto the bench in the long bronze light, and sat him there and watched the diamond stock, home again, come down to water. The cattle waded into the shallows, and drank and stood, slick and gentle and sound, the old diamond plain on every left hip, and, on some, a false kite's tail already beginning to fade toward the honest mark beneath it. The way a lie fades off a thing, when the truth under it is finally let alone to grow back. The swallows cut low over the creek after the evening insects. The storm gray gelding dropped his head, and sighed the long sigh a good horse gives at the end of a day, and Della Rourke sat the 17 hands of storm-colored horse, and let the hour do to her what it had always done, and thought about her father, who had ridden into this country a poor man, and found the diamond in the dust, and held it with his 2 hands, and left it to her, with a saying she had spent a hard year learning the whole weight of. The prairie gives you dust in the one hand and a diamond in the other, and the art of living out here is knowing which is which, and closing your fingers on the right one before the wind comes up. She had closed her fingers on the diamond and held it through a year that had tried every way it knew to open her hand, and she had not let go, and here it was, home watering in the last light, hers and her father's, and no man's else, dust in the one hand, and in the other, standing storm colored against the burning western sky above the last free water in the Sweetgrass country, sound and gentle and famous and safe, the diamond. And the low sun poured its brass across the saved grass and the running creek, and the horse blew softly under her. And the woman in the faded blue dress sat her great gray horse in the gold and the coming dusk, and was, for the length of that hour, entirely and simply glad, and there was no rope in the country with her name on it, and there never would be again.